In recent years, the world has faced various crises, such as pandemics and wars, and the United Nations, whose mission is to maintain global peace and security, often seems unable to help in these situations. Many people criticize the UN as being ineffective, claiming it spends a lot of money without making much of an impact. So, is the UN still necessary for the world? Let's discuss the United Nations today. Recently, the BBC released a documentary featuring several former UN staff members who accused the organization of multiple cases of high-level sexual harassment and abuse against subordinates, which have allegedly been covered up. One investigator mentioned that the sexual assault allegations he handled were dismissed by superiors, and a victim stated that after reporting her boss, not only did the case go unresolved, but he was also fired by the UN. This has led many to question how the UN, an organization established to address global issues, can be trusted to handle international affairs when it faces problems like corruption and abuse of power. Moreover, aside from these allegations, more and more people feel that the UN only talks the talk. While it promotes world peace and calls for unity among nations, it often lacks tangible actions when significant issues arise. For Taiwan, the situation is even more complicated, as the UN does not allow its membership, leading to mixed feelings. However, the complex history between Taiwan and the UN deserves its own discussion. So today, we will focus on what the UN has accomplished in its 77 years of existence. What exactly is its purpose? Before we dive into these discussions, let's take a moment for a brief commercial break. Are you looking to help your child develop essential daily living skills? Consider Mango Dog. Mango Dog is a life education picture book designed by Jingxin, covering topics like how to cross the street, preventing getting lost in stores, and other safety behaviors. It also addresses important life concepts such as establishing personal boundaries, understanding feelings of frustration, and accepting highly sensitive friends. Since its release, it has been very popular, with many parents reporting that their kids want to read it every day. Additionally, there's the much-loved treasure hunt activity book, which encourages kids to observe details in Taiwanese settings, fun and a great way to practice sustained attention. Right now, you can get the complete set of 10 books with an incredible discount of 2,000 TWD off, and by using the exclusive discount code GG77, you can get an extra 10% off. Click the link in the info section to check it out on the official website. The United Nations, born from war, aiming for peace. The United Nations originated from the League of Nations, established after World War I as the first international organization primarily tasked with maintaining world peace. In its early years, it played a certain role by establishing various international consensus and systems. However, the League had significant limitations, notably its lack of its own military force. It relied on major powers to enforce its resolutions and provide military support. When these major powers did not cooperate, the League often found itself powerless. A prominent example of this was when Germany, Italy, and Japan repeatedly invaded other countries, and the League could not stop them, ultimately leading to the outbreak of World War II, which marked the League's failure. Consequently, the Allied powers, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, decided to establish a new organization to replace the League of Nations. Thus, after World War II, the United Nations was born. The initial purpose of the UN was to end war, maintain international peace, and protect human rights. Over time, it has also taken on new missions, such as addressing global issues like climate change. So, how does the UN execute these missions? How does the United Nations operate? The United Nations has over 35,000 official staff members worldwide, with an annual budget exceeding $60 billion, primarily funded through contributions from member states. The UN's internal structure consists of 5 main bodies. First, there's the United Nations General Assembly, composed of all member states. This body functions somewhat like a parliament, where each country has one vote. During the annual meetings, the Assembly reviews the UN's budget and certain personnel appointments, and proposes and votes on various international issues. Considering the past failures of the League of Nations, the UN established the Security Council, which consists of 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members. Its main mission is to maintain peace, and it has the authority to impose economic sanctions, enforce arms embargoes, or deploy UN peacekeeping forces for military action. Additionally, there's the Economic and Social Council, which promotes international cooperation and development, the International Court of Justice, which resolves legal disputes between countries, and the Secretariat, which manages the day-to-day affairs of the UN. Beyond these internal bodies, the UN system includes around 30 affiliated organizations and specialized agencies, such as UNICEF, UNESCO, UNHCR, WFP, the Climate Change Committee, and the WHO. In summary, the UN operates somewhat like a government of governments, but unlike a typical government, it lacks substantial coercive power. Instead, it relies on persuasion among nations, such as by issuing climate reports and calling for collective action on climate issues. Given this structure, can the UN truly achieve its objectives? Achievements of the United Nations. Despite many controversies, the United Nations has achieved certain successes by general standards. In terms of its primary goal of maintaining peace, there has indeed been no large-scale world war since its establishment, and it has facilitated the creation of international treaties that limit nuclear weapons and biological weapons. In humanitarian aid, the UN has supported many of the most vulnerable populations. It has provided assistance to over 69 million refugees and supplied clean water to 1.3 billion people in developing countries. The organization has also played a role in controlling diseases like smallpox and Ebola. Furthermore, regarding the climate crisis, the UN has facilitated the signing of numerous related treaties, including the universally ratified Paris Agreement. Thus, the UN has helped humanity avoid potential nuclear conflicts, improved environmental hygiene in many areas, and saved countless lives. However, when it comes to its founding principles of maintaining peace and promoting human rights, the general consensus is that the UN still falls short and, at times, may even hinder progress. The failures of the United Nations? Since its founding, the United Nations has faced persistent criticism for being too weak and ineffective in preventing wars and humanitarian crises. For instance, after the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, the UN was unable to make a decisive demand for a ceasefire. Additionally, when it comes to countries that violate human rights, the UN often struggles to impose effective sanctions and sometimes doesn't even manage to issue a straightforward condemnation. Recently, the UN Human Rights Commissioner visited Xinjiang but did not publicly question the Chinese government regarding human rights issues there. Instead, they referred to the detention camps for Uyghurs as re-education centers. Even when the UN takes action, its actual effectiveness is often called into question. For example, during the conflicts in Rwanda and Bosnia, the UN deployed troops to the regions but failed to prevent genocide. Furthermore, the UN's latest reports indicate that the climate crisis continues to worsen, making it unlikely that the goals of the Paris Agreement will be achieved. To make matters worse, the United States even withdrew from the Paris Agreement at one point, highlighting the limited effectiveness of these international treaties. Beyond criticisms of its operational shortcomings, the UN has also been marred by numerous scandals. Recent reports from the BBC have revealed internal sexual assault cases, and UN peacekeeping forces have frequently been implicated in sexual exploitation of local women or even human trafficking. Why, then, does a large organization that encompasses nearly all countries in the world struggle to perform its duties, and even get things wrong? The dilemma of the United Nations, an outdated power structure. Many scholars analyze that one major reason for the UN's inefficacy is its organizational power structure, which is seen as too rigid, undemocratic, and outdated. For example, while the United Nations General Assembly reflects the opinions of various countries, its power is very limited. Most decisions made by the Assembly are merely recommendations and lack enforceability. In contrast, real authority to impose sanctions and use military force lies with the UN Security Council, which is composed of a few countries. Notably, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council hold veto power, allowing them to overturn Assembly decisions to protect themselves or their allies. This has led to the UN's inability to take timely action on various issues. For instance, in recent years, the United States has frequently used its veto power, often related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, while China has used its veto to block resolutions sanctioning North Korea. Additionally, at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, the General Assembly overwhelmingly passed a resolution demanding Russian forces stop their invasion, which was subsequently vetoed by Russia. Many believe that this structure of the 5 permanent members is not only undemocratic but also no longer represents the current global landscape. These 5 countries were the victorious powers of World War II, and their composition does not include significant nations today, such as India, Japan, and Germany, which are important both demographically and economically. Furthermore, there is no representation from Africa or Central and South America. Given these numerous issues, what direction should the future of the UN take? The United Nations, where should it go from here? Many scholars argue that the world still needs organizations like the United Nations to provide a platform for dialogue among countries. Otherwise, the international system could fall into chaos. Additionally, the UN's humanitarian work in many impoverished and war-torn regions is hard to replace with other organizations. However, in recent years, with the global challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war, the UN has shown its inability to effectively address these crises, reigniting calls for reform. Among the most prominent demands is the reform of the Security Council, such as increasing the number of permanent members to make it more representative, and even proposals to limit or eliminate the veto power of the 5 permanent members. In April of this year, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution requiring the permanent members to provide justifications for their use of veto power. While this request does not directly prohibit the use of veto power and lacks enforceability, some scholars believe it could raise the political cost of exercising the veto and symbolizes an important first step toward enhancing accountability and transparency in the decision-making process. Moreover, many scholars caution that the UN is not a panacea. As the second UN Secretary-General once said, the UN exists to help humanity escape from hell, not to take it to heaven. However, some propose that while the UN may not be able to completely prevent crises, it can still improve its crisis management capabilities. For instance, establishing a new platform for countries to assess and discuss emerging situations could be a viable approach. Our perspective in recent years, we have witnessed how the COVID-19 pandemic completely disrupted global order. If this had happened centuries ago, when communication was limited, such a pandemic might not have had worldwide repercussions. However, in today's highly interconnected and interdependent world, many issues can have far-reaching effects. If the WHO, part of the United Nations, had issued timely warnings about the pandemic and shared relevant information, many situations might not have escalated to such severity. Thus, we believe that the world desperately needs a platform for countries to assist each other through resource integration and information exchange. Yet, from many perspectives, the UN's performance has been disappointing, sometimes even exacerbating problems. This issue may stem from the inherent contradictions in the UN's operations, as it relies on the willingness of resource-rich countries to support it. If powerful nations withdraw their resources or openly oppose its initiatives, many critical issues may struggle to be addressed. Moreover, it feels powerless to consider replacing the UN with another organization, as we might encounter similar situations. As Taiwanese, our feelings toward the UN are especially complex. While we feel it has treated us poorly, we also long to join. In participating in various international affairs, we often face numerous restrictions and internal doubts. For instance, Taiwan has consistently responded to UN initiatives, yet many still question, what's the point? The UN won't let Taiwan join anyway. We believe that not being able to join the UN is indeed a regret. However, regardless of our membership status, we are inherently part of this world. What matters most is our desire for the world to become a better place, as a better world means a better Taiwan. Thus, when there is a need in the world and we have the capability to help, we choose to contribute our efforts. Rather than seeking recognition, we feel it's more meaningful to know that we are doing what UN members are expected to do, and that we are genuinely making a difference.
In the entire context of the Ukraine-Russia war, a keyword that keeps coming up is NATO. This term has gained a lot of exposure, yet many people still don't quite understand what NATO actually is and why it has become a focal point of this conflict. Today, let's take some time to discuss NATO. Hello everyone, I'm Jiqi, and welcome to the Vocabulary Deep Dive, where we decode mysterious terms for those who hear but don't quite understand. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is an international organization composed of North American and European countries, currently consisting of 30 member states, including the United States, Germany, Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and others. Since the outbreak of the Ukraine-Russia war, NATO's name has been mentioned repeatedly. One of Russia's reasons for starting the war is its dissatisfaction with NATO's eastward expansion and its demand that Ukraine not join NATO. Why is Russia so concerned about NATO? What exactly does this organization do? Let's discuss this together. But before we dive in, let's take a moment for a word from our sponsor. Do your proposal presentations often leave your supervisors or clients feeling unclear or unfocused? No matter what field you work in, if you have a need for organizing information and improving communication, you won't want to miss today's introduction to the Information Structure X Visual Design and Graphic Communication course. This course will not only teach you how to think structurally but also include hands-on practice. Additionally, you'll receive information design templates that you can use to effectively convey your data and ideas, enhancing your professionalism. Right now, you can purchase the course at a crowdfunding discount of over 43% off, and if you use our exclusive promo code SHASHA77, you can save an additional $300. With such great deals, don't hesitate, click the link in the information section below to check out more details about the course. Why was NATO established? Why was NATO created? In simple terms, it was established to counter communism. Let's take a step back to the late 1940s, just after World War II ended. At that time, European countries were severely weakened by the war, while the United States, having not suffered from the destruction of war on its own soil, emerged as the world's leading superpower. With the Axis powers defeated, the US turned its attention to the next potential enemy, the rising threat of communism, particularly the Soviet Union. Many European countries were struggling economically, and the US was concerned that the Soviet Union might take advantage of their vulnerabilities. To help Europe recover quickly, the US launched the European version of aid, known as the Marshall Plan, in 1948. This plan aimed to provide $13 billion in support to European countries, equivalent to about $150 billion today when adjusted for inflation. However, economic assistance alone was not enough, actual military cooperation was crucial as well. In 1949, the US, Canada, and 10 European countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty, committing to establish a military organization for collective defense. This organization is what we now know as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, headquartered in Brussels, Belgium. When we talk about such multinational cooperation, one might immediately think of another organization, the United Nations. While all NATO members are indeed UN members and the UN has its own military forces, why was it necessary to establish NATO separately? NATO versus the United Nations. Although the United Nations has its own forces, deploying them requires the approval of the UN Security Council. The Soviet Union was a permanent member of the Security Council and held veto power, allowing it to block any military actions it opposed. This means that if the UN wanted to initiate military actions against the Soviet Union, it was unlikely to receive consent. Therefore, to counter the Soviet Union, it was necessary to turn to other organizations, and NATO was one such military defense alliance. In addition to the armed forces of its member countries, NATO also has its own rapid response forces, consisting of approximately 40,000 troops. Today, NATO can mobilize nearly 3.5 million personnel. A key aspect of the NATO treaty is Article 5, which states that an attack on any NATO member is considered an attack on the entire alliance. This means that if any NATO member is attacked, all other NATO members will immediately come to its defense. Under these conditions, the Soviet Union would likely be deterred from acting against NATO countries for fear of igniting a world war. So far, there have been almost no instances of countries expressing hostility toward NATO member states. The only historical case where a NATO member was attacked, prompting the full mobilization of NATO, occurred after the 9/11 attacks in 2011, which led to NATO's involvement in the subsequent war in Afghanistan. That said, if NATO was established to counter the Soviet Union, how did the Soviet Union respond? How did the Soviet Union respond to NATO? When NATO was established, the Soviet Union did not back down. In 1955, it created the Warsaw Pact as a counterbalance to NATO. The formal name of the Warsaw Pact was the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, and it was signed in Warsaw, Poland, hence the name. During the Cold War, NATO represented the Western Bloc and anti-communist forces, while the Warsaw Pact represented the Eastern Bloc and communist forces. The Warsaw Pact also had a clause similar to NATO's Article 5, stating that an attack on any member of the Warsaw Pact would be considered an attack on the entire alliance. Fortunately, during the Cold War, NATO and the Warsaw Pact did not engage in direct conflict. However, with the internal instability of the Communist bloc, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved in July 1991. Later that year, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was renamed the Russian Federation, which is what we now refer to as Russia. The sudden collapse of the Soviet Union caught Western countries off guard, leaving them uncertain about the new Russia's intentions and whether it differed from the former Soviet Union. As a precaution, they allowed NATO to continue to exist. Additionally, some former Soviet and Warsaw Pact member countries, fearing potential retaliation from Russia, sought to join NATO, leading to a rapid increase in NATO's membership. This expansion angered Russia significantly. Why does Ukraine want to join NATO? Before the outbreak of the war, Ukraine had many complex considerations about whether to join NATO. The benefits of membership include military protection against the threatening presence of Russia. However, joining NATO could also provoke Russia and increase the risk of military conflict, putting Ukraine in a difficult position. Since 2008, Ukraine has sought NATO membership, but immediate results were not forthcoming. In 2010, the election of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych led to a pause in Ukraine's NATO aspirations. After 2014, the subsequent two presidents took a more pro-European stance, aiming not only for economic cooperation with the EU but also for military collaboration with NATO. In 2019, Ukraine even amended its constitution to prioritize joining both the EU and NATO. However, the situation changed significantly with the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war. While NATO member countries have condemned Russia and provided varying degrees of assistance to Ukraine in an effort to protect its sovereignty, they are cautious about engaging in direct military conflict with Russia, which has influenced their stance on Ukraine's NATO membership. Currently, Ukraine is actively seeking military assistance from NATO member states, but reports suggest that Ukraine is willing to compromise on NATO membership to alleviate Russian tensions. The situation remains fluid, and the future is still uncertain. What many are concerned about now is whether NATO can effectively fulfill its role in this context. Why does Russia dislike NATO? Why is Russia so unhappy with NATO? There are several explanations for this issue. Some commentators argue that Russia essentially sees itself as the reincarnation of the Soviet Union. Even though the Soviet Union has collapsed, many in Russia still view the territories of the former Soviet states as part of Russia's sphere of influence, which should not be subjected to interference from Western powers. As NATO was created to counter the Soviet Union, it naturally causes significant concern for Russia. Russia has repeatedly warned that NATO should not allow former Soviet republics to join. However, NATO maintains that these countries have the right to join if they meet the necessary criteria. Since the 1990s, several former Warsaw Pact and Soviet countries, such as the Czech Republic, Hungary, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, have joined NATO, leading to a gradual eastward expansion of NATO's influence closer to Russian borders. Additionally, NATO's military deployments near Russia have provoked further dissatisfaction. For example, in 2010, NATO established missile defense systems in Poland and Romania. After the outbreak of the Crimea conflict in 2014, NATO deployed multinational forces in countries neighboring Russia, such as Poland, Lithuania, and Estonia. Due to these reasons, Russia views NATO as its number one enemy, with Ukraine becoming a key flashpoint in this conflict. Russia has strongly opposed Ukraine's potential NATO membership because if Ukraine were to join, Russia would lose a significant buffer zone, allowing Western military forces to pose a direct threat to Russian territory. This concern has become one of the triggers for the current war. So, what does Ukraine think about this situation? Is NATO useful? Over its 70-plus years of history, NATO has not had many opportunities to showcase its effectiveness. During the Cold War, NATO did not engage in actual military actions. After the Cold War, some critics argued that NATO had become a US-led global police alliance. It conducted airstrikes in the former Yugoslavia, facilitated Kosovo's independence, and participated in the wars in Afghanistan and Libya under the pretext of maintaining regional peace and preventing humanitarian crises. However, these military interventions sparked significant controversy both within NATO and outside of it. Moreover, NATO member countries do not always see eye to eye, each has its own national interests to consider. For instance, former U.S. President Donald Trump criticized NATO allies for contributing too little to military spending, claiming the U.S. was shouldering an unfair burden and threatening to withdraw from NATO. Meanwhile, France, another major power, expressed dissatisfaction with its lack of influence in NATO and even withdrew from the organization for a time, only rejoining in 2009. Current French President Emmanuel Macron has gone so far as to describe NATO as brain dead, suggesting it is losing its relevance. However, with the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, the perceived threat from Russia has revitalized NATO's importance. Many NATO member states have committed to increasing military spending and enhancing military cooperation. Additionally, countries that were not originally NATO members, like Finland and Sweden, have indicated they may consider joining NATO, prompted by their proximity to Russia. Many commentators suggest that Russia's aggression has, paradoxically, helped to unite and reinvigorate this organization that some viewed as fading. Our perspective in researching this topic, we found that, like many international issues, opinions on NATO are highly polarized. On one hand, some argue that NATO claims to protect regional peace while spending a significant amount of money, yet it seems to have little impact. For instance, in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, NATO's presence appears to have exacerbated international tensions. Instead of maintaining world peace, it seems to have indirectly contributed to the outbreak of war, leading some to suggest that it might be better for the organization to disband. On the other hand, there are those who believe that even without NATO, Russia would not simply abandon its ambitions. The perceived threats wouldn't automatically vanish without NATO, and thus its existence acts as a deterrent, similar to high-impact weaponry. Even if NATO doesn't fully achieve its intended effects, it can still exert a certain level of restraint on Russia. Of course, as previously mentioned, NATO member countries have their own interests, and their roles and attitudes can shift due to the dynamics of international politics. However, it's clear that the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war will bring increased scrutiny to NATO's position. We will continue to observe how this situation evolves in the future.
Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was a union of several Soviet republics including Russia. Rising after the collapse of the Russian Empire, the USSR would later become a superpower rivaling the US in military and economic power. With a population of 290 million in 1989, the USSR was also the third most populous country in the world behind China and India. It was a constitutionally socialist state that existed from 1922 to 1991. During World War II, the USSR officially became a world power after it teamed with the Allies to defeat Germany. After the war, relations between the USSR and USA deteriorated, leading to the Cold War and the start of the space race. The USSR was born from the collapse of the Russian Empire. Officially proclaimed by Peter the Great in 1721, the Russian Empire would survive for nearly 200 years and at its peak had a population of 176 million and the largest army in the world. But, like the USSR later would be, the Russian Empire was defeated from within as inflation, strikes, and food shortages frustrated its people, triggering the Russian Revolution of 1917. At its inception, the USSR was a union of 4 Soviet socialist republics. However, its power was not secure until after the end of the Russian Civil War in 1921. In 1923, Joseph Stalin would step up to head the USSR. Starting in 1928, he would begin to aggressively build the economy based on a socialist perspective. The new economy of the USSR was a socialist economy with the goal of industrialization. Agriculture collective farms were established across the country and prosperous peasants who were against the new economy were sent to labor camps or killed. Many members of the Communist Party who had opposing views on issues important to Stalin were executed. Even with the brutality of the Communist Party towards the people, the Soviet Union was able to develop a powerful industrial economy within 10 years of Stalin's rise to power. With its large population, the USSR was a formidable obstacle if angered, and the Nazis signed the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in order to keep them from interfering in their invasions across Europe. In 1939, the pact was broken and Stalin ordered his forces to invade Finland, a German possession. This caused Germany to later invade the Soviet Union in 1941. The Soviets battled the Germans through the winter and then were able to turn back the German offensive at the Battle of Stalingrad. Though millions had died and the infrastructure of Western Russia was heavily damaged, Russia was victorious and came out of World War II as a superpower along with the United States. The post-World War II was a prosperous time for the USSR, and Soviet influence spread elsewhere in the world, especially into Eastern Europe. However, starting in the mid-1940s, rising tensions resulting from the difference in views on how to reconstruct the post-World War II world caused the Cold War. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died and was eventually replaced with Nikita Khrushchev, who worked to lessen the restrictions that had been put in place by Stalin. During his time in office, Khrushchev would work to make reforms on agriculture and foreign policy and would also lead the USSR through the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The missile crisis signified the lowest point in relations between the two countries, with war narrowly averted when the Khrushchev agreed to remove missiles from Cuba on condition that U.S. President John F. Kennedy remove missiles from Turkey. Starting in the mid-1960s, the Soviet Union entered a period of stagnation and it could no longer keep up with the United States commercially. The Soviet leadership also began to age and was criticized for being against change. As the Soviet Union stagnated, its political and economical structure began to crumble as it had before the Russian Revolution many years before. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev took office and began immediately to introduce reforms. In the late 80s, member states of the Soviet Union began to explore the idea of seceding, and cries for independence were fueled by lawmakers passing laws to supersede those already in place by the Soviet Union. A referendum was held and passed which allowed the USSR to stay together temporarily, but in December of 1991, the Belovezh Accords was signed by the leaders of Russia and other members of the Soviet Union, officially dissolving the USSR. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was a union of several Soviet republics including Russia. Rising after the collapse of the Russian Empire, the USSR would later become a superpower rivaling the US in military and economic power. With a population of 290 million in 1989, the USSR was also the third most populous country in the world behind China and India. It was a constitutionally socialist state that existed from 1922 to 1991. During World War II, the USSR officially became a world power after it teamed with the Allies to defeat Germany. After the war, relations between the USSR and USA deteriorated, leading to the Cold War and the start of the space race.
Korean War. The Korean War was a war between the Communist forces of North Korea, China, and Russia against UN, South Korean, and US forces. It was the result of border clashes between the two Korean regimes that were created during the split of Korea after World War II. In June of 1950, the war began when North Korean forces attacked the South. The war moved at a rapid speed in the early stages, with North Korean forces easily defeated the outmatched South Koreans. However, by January 1951, the battles had evolved into trench warfare. Later, forces from China, BEUN and the United States would join the war on different sides of two regimes. Fighting would last until July 27, 1953, when a ceasefire was reached. During the war, the South Korean side lost 474,000 men, while North Korea, China, and Russia lost 1.5 million. The seeds for the Korean War were laid during World War II, when in August of 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and attacked the northern half of the Korean peninsula, which was under Japanese control. As the United States the South, Soviet forces would sweep down from the north and advance to the 38-inch parallel, at which time it stopped as agreed with the United States. Though had been divided by the two superpowers, Koreans were optimistic that they would be able to self-rule after being under Japanese rule since being annexed in 1910. Resentment of the American occupation began when Japanese administrators were restored to their posts even and political organizations formed by the Korean people were not recognized. In 1949, Kim Il-sung notified Stalin that he wished to reunify the peninsula. The politics of both sides were different, though, with the North being communist and the South being democratic. Stalin refused to authorize an attack, stating that he did not want the United States to get involved in any conflict. Kim Il-sung interpreted this answer as a call to strengthen his army and began to build his army into a formidable war machine. Its ranks were bolstered by battle-tested Korean veterans who had fought in World War II under the Chinese flag. Meanwhile, the leader of the South Korean regime, Ri, also wished to unite the peninsula under his government. However, South Korea remained weaker than North Korea, even though it was rapidly catching up in terms of military power. Kim Il-sung knew that if he wanted to reunify the peninsula, he would have to act immediately. In June of 1950, North Korean forces crossed the border in a full-on offensive. Possessing an arsenal of Soviet-made tanks and planes, the North Koreans rolled over the defending South Korean and United Nations forces. Korean civilians fled south, but many were killed later on during the numerous North Korean bombing campaigns. The South Korean army was no match for the North Koreans, and many defected to North Korea or were forced to retreat during the opening days of the war. On June 28, 1950, the North Korean forces captured Seoul. With defeat for the South Koreans imminent, the United States was forced to intervene. U.S. President Harry S. Truman ordered the transfer of munitions to the South Korean army. Taiwan asked for permission to join the war, but their request was denied by Truman, who feared that Taiwanese participation in the war would cause China to side with the North Koreans. The North Koreans continued to advance across the peninsula, and by September of 1950 only 10% of the peninsula was still under the control of the Allies. Only the area of Pusan was firmly under South Korean control. The United States sent in air support and supplies, while UN forces stabilized an important area near the Nakdong River. After receiving permission from Truman, General MacArthur of the U.S. forces sent in 70,000 Marines and the Army's 7-inch Infantry Division to Incheon. Incheon was not heavily d by the North Koreans, and the landing units were able to crush the Korean defenders. Immediately pressing towards Seoul, the city was recaptured by U.S. forces and the North Koreans were forced to retreat back on October 8, 1950. The leader of China, Mao Zedong, ordered his forces assemble at the North Korean border. Nearly a month later, Chinese forces would attack in mass, swarming around the flanks of the U.S. and South Korean forces which had been advancing into North Korea at the time. By marching at night and remaining concealed from view during the daytime, the Chinese were able to move in their troops without the knowledge of the Allies. The sudden emergence of Chinese troops surprised the Allied troops, defeating the U.S. 8th Army and causing a long retreat by U.S. forces. The U.S. 7-inch Infantry Division fared worse, being surrounded by Chinese troops before dealing a heavy blow to the Chinese forces and escaping at the cost of 15,000 casualties. The vast numbers of Chinese troops rattled the UN forces and they were unable to successfully defend Seoul, allowing it to fall to Chinese forces in January 1951. In March of 1951, the 8th Army, having been restocked with men, moved to attack Seoul and expelled North Korean and Chinese troops from the city. In 1951, Truman removed MacArthur from command of the U.S. forces. The war would continue for another 2 years with several large offensives, including the Spring Offensive featuring 700,000 soldiers, but the offensive was halted at defensive line. Further loss of land for either side was minimal, and in July of 51 peace negotiations began. Fighting continued during the peace negotiations as each side wished to control a larger block of land in order to strengthen their negotiation position. This time-wasting approach led to negotiations taking place for 2 years when the border, as it had been in 1951, was designated the official border between the two countries. The ceasefire continues to this day, with the demilitarized zone in between the two Koreas being the most heavily fortified border in the world.